Hola, buenas tardes. ¿Cómo están? Les damos la bienvenida a esta segunda sesión de la serie de seminarios web llamado Gobernanzas Urbanas en Tiempos Constituyentes. En esta ocasión vamos a contar con la presencia de Caren Levy, que nos va a dar una muy interesante presentación llamada Coproducción de Conocimiento para fortalecer la gobernanza urbana, evaluación de posibilidades y limitaciones. Y contaremos también con los comentarios de Paola Jirón a continuación. Solo a modo de introducción quisiéramos mencionar un poco las características de la presentación. En particular, la presentación que veremos hoy habla de la experiencia en gran medida del proyecto KNOW, Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality, que busca avanzar en temas de prosperidad, resiliencia y enfrentar la pobreza a partir de la co-construcción de conocimiento, con un enfoque de acciones redistributivas e integradas. En un escenario de desigualdades urbanas, donde las desigualdades urbanas impactan profundamente en los sectores más vulnerables de las ciudades y territorios, iniciativas como KNOW nos invitan también a repensar críticamente cómo, como dice el título de la presentación, de hecho, cómo el fortalecimiento de la gobernanza urbana, cómo fortalecemos la gobernanza urbana en definitiva, donde la experiencia y el conocimiento local de sus habitantes juegan un rol clave en la toma de decisiones. Sin más preámbulo, para darle paso a Caren y su presentación, solamente quisiera hacer una breve introducción bibliográfica, una pequeña biografía de Caren. Caren Levy es Professor of Transformative Urban Planning en la Bartlett Development Planning Unit en University College London. Su investigación se centra en la producción de conocimiento interdisciplinario y aplicado en el contexto de la teoría del desarrollo, la política y la práctica de la planificación en una amplia variedad de escenarios organizacionales, tanto institucionales como geográficos. Como tema común, se destaca el desarrollo de metodologías centradas en la institucionalización de la justicia social en las políticas y la planificación, en el contexto de las desigualdades en el sur global. Actualmente, ella dirige el proyecto KNOW, Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality, que es un consorcio global de investigadores e investigadoras de 3 instituciones que se concentran en 9 ciudades de Asia, África y América Latina. Ahora, sin más preámbulo, damos la palabra a Caren para que inicie su presentación. Muchas gracias, Caren, por estar con nosotros. Estamos muy emocionados de tenerte acá y escuchar tu exposición.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And thank you for the invitation to join this series on urban governance in constituent times. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to approach this topic through the lens of co-production, as you said, Rodrigo. And the co-production of knowledge is a central principle in the operation of this 4-year research program that you mentioned, Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality, or what I'll refer to as KNOW, or the KNOW program. And in doing this, I'll use some examples from the KNOW program that have emerged over the last 4 years to illustrate the arguments that I'm going to make. But to start, I want to briefly outline the context out of which the KNOW program actually emerged. It's a context very familiar to everybody, so I'm going to be very short in my framing of the program. As you know, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we saw a shift in the ideas about governing, encapsulated in that phrase, from government to governance. And this really impacted on local urban governance by fragmenting urban governance in many different ways, but primarily through the increasing privatization of local services, which then brought in both local but also a lot of global actors to urban areas around the provision of services and investment in land and housing. And created a new set of roles, not just for the private sector, but also for the public sector, and ultimately also for civil society. In this process, most cities, and through this process, most cities have experienced increasing inequalities in different ways. And they're obviously in each city, they have their own particular characteristic. But what one can see in terms of common trends is the increasing financialization of housing and land markets, leading to increased insecurity and evictions in many places, increased precarity in work and income earning conditions, and a range of other inequalities resulting in the exclusion of many urban dwellers from different aspects of urban life. And what one has to say in an examination of this history is that policy and planning as a so-called professional expertise, I put in inverted commas, and as a practice is not innocent in this process. It has been complicit and contributed to the reproduction of inequalities in cities and urban areas in different ways. And this is something that the No program and the DPU as a whole, along with many, many others, are critiquing and seeking to transform. And I think when we talk about urban governance, we also need to recognize another dimension in this discussion, which is that all of this has gone on at the same time as the continued ambivalence of central government about decentralization and local democratization in most contexts. Local governments are in constant negotiation about the terms of their decentralization with central governments around responsibilities, around the budgets that they have. And of course, on the political side, there are political tensions around local democracy and representation, particularly where local political parties are at odds with national political parties in power. And so it's not surprising that there's a huge body of work looking at central local tensions, looking at questions of accountability and transparency as a part of developing a deeper understanding of urban governance. Now, as we know, civil society hasn't been passive in this process. I would say that it was largely excluded in the first considerations of this neoliberal turn, but civil society has been organizing, mobilizing against injustices, making claims and demanding the right to the city in a range of different areas over this time. And the No program has sought to build on these struggles in order to strengthen the capacities to address these inequalities. So what I'm going to do now is to share my screen and to look specifically at the No program, just to briefly introduce elements of it to you in the furtherance of my argument. So just broadly speaking, if we look at the aims, the partners, and the principles, the aims of the No program are to strengthen governance pathways to urban equality through transformative research for urban equality, building research capacity. And this is an interesting dimension of the No program. It was included in the original call that this kind of research wasn't just about research, but also about capacity building. And the third aspect of the No program is to develop what we've called urban learning hubs, really a network of actors who are all working together towards trying to strengthen pathways to urban equality. And I can say a bit more about that as we go. Now, as Rodrigo said, the No program is an international consortium of 13 partners across 12 cities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And I'm going to draw on examples, as I said, from some of these places to illustrate my arguments. At the center of the No program, of course, as the title indicates, knowledge in action for urban equality, is the notion of urban equality. And we have treated urban equality as a kind of working definition. We started with what we call a placeholder definition of urban equality, which has changed and expanded over time. Broadly speaking, it covers the distributive dimension of equality, the distribution of material, the material aspects of life. It looks at what we've called reciprocal recognition. In other words, how it is that social identities of urban dwellers are recognized in the way that policy and planning and activism is practiced. And when I mean social identities, I mean identities around class, around gender, around age, around ethnicity, and sexuality and disability as appropriate to particular contexts. And not surprisingly, of course, we're also concerned with parity political participation, a city that engages with all its citizens and representatives from diverse social groups in deliberations, in imaginaries, in decisions about the current and future city. And a fourth dimension, which has become really important and has shown its presence in the pandemic, which is around the care and mutual solidarity, a city that actually prioritizes mutual support and the relation responsibilities, not only between citizens, but also between citizens and nature, and actually actively nurtures the civic life of the city. And as I said, this vision of urban equality is something that we've worked with and changed and adapted through the project. And it's been translated in a very context-specific way in the different cities of the KNOW program. Now, another central element of the KNOW program, you can understand that the KNOW program contains a range and a set of relationships. And so actually what for us governs those relationships is what I've called partnerships with equivalence. And this notion of partnerships with equivalence is a really important notion to think about in the context of the extremely unequal political economy of higher education globally, and indeed in the unequal relations that are set up often in international research projects, which are funded, in this case, as the KNOW program is, by UK aid, foreign aid. And so one simply cannot ignore the potential relationships that that kind of context sets up. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about the implications of that and how that impacts on the way we think about working together. And not surprisingly, one of the key principles out of this kind of operation is to build a mutual respect between everybody in the team, to make sure that we practice reciprocal transparency and accountability, not just to the research and capacity building, but also to the governance, the management, and the way we use resources in the program. And central to that, and where the presentation today is foundational, is the co-production of knowledge, that we're committed to the co-production of knowledge between actors and partners in civil society, the public and the private sectors. And this isn't just about co-producing the production of knowledge, but also the dissemination of knowledge. And finally, a really critical principle in partnerships with equivalence is what I've called co-learning. And this is really the dynamic of the partnership, because this is what will sustain and rejuvenate the partnership over time, is the way that we learn through reflexive practice, grounded learning between the different institutions and different places in the project. And this has been an amazing challenge and an amazing way of working, a very productive way of working. And what we can see is in the KNOW program that these principles have been scaled up and translated into the different city contexts. In other words, into the practices of urban governance itself. And so what on the ground in the different cities, the program has tried to promote the mutual respect between all actors and respect for their diverse identities and respect for their different languages, not just the actual languages they speak, but the respect of the language of bureaucracy as well as the everyday languages of people. And also, of course, promoting reciprocal transparency and accountability, not only in the practices, but also the procedures governing institutions, and promoting the idea of the co-production of knowledge as an important way to build a different urban governance. And not surprisingly, again, this dynamic of co-learning, of actually learning through doing, because of course we don't get it right all the time. And we have to have mechanisms of learning as we go, reflecting on what happens and building the spaces in which we can actually exchange knowledge and build a real basis for addressing the very great challenges of inequality that many cities face. So what I want to do now is to go on to just talk a little bit about knowledge co-production itself. And from our point of view, the logic or the rationale for focusing on knowledge co-production is very important to establish. Of course, it's a recognition of the right of all urban dwellers to participate in knowledge production, in the debates and the decisions that affect their lives. And of course, it also is a way that acknowledges the multiple ways in which expertise may be produced amongst all actors, including vulnerable communities. So this is a really critical quotation here, challenging the idea that expertise is only located in one part of amongst city actors, but actually we would regard in a knowledge co-production process expertise being shared by all actors in different ways. And it also acknowledges the context specificity of urban conditions in which urban dwellers find themselves. We can't expect to say that the situation in Lima is going to be the same as in Dar es Salaam and is the same as in Da Nang. The all cities of the No program, that the context specificity has to be recognized in the process. But we would argue that if knowledge co-production is practiced, it has the potential to accelerate wider processes of social learning. And in doing that, in sharing the co-production of knowledge, it can simultaneously and reciprocally build capacity, build awareness and consciousness of the realities of different people's lives, but also has the potential to confront assumptions in wider discourses and in development practices that may actually obstruct transformative change towards urban equality. And in this sense, in other words, it has the potential to reframe understandings of urban development, of planning, of social action. And in that sense, it is just one strategy that could generate collective action necessary to navigate urban trajectories towards urban equality. So I know there's a lot of claims here, and I just want to show you in three examples from the No program of three governance pathways which have begun to emerge over the 4 years of the program, which might demonstrate how it is that No production can work in that way. And I identify these pathways, but also to say that they're not separate from each other. Sometimes they merge into each other in different ways, and that will become apparent as I discuss them. The first pathway is the strengthening of civil society capacities to co-produce knowledge. And here we're talking about creating partnerships with equivalence between communities, NGOs, and academia, all very strong partners within the No program. And the strategies that have been used here have been capacity building, the training of trainers, in this case, community trainers to build capacities in communities, community exchanges, which is a tool used by the Slum Dwellers International widely promoted and a very powerful tool for learning, where communities learn from each other's experience of doing things. And also, of course, learning by doing, actually carrying out collective self-enumeration with support from NGOs and academia, and undertaking the kind of knowledge production that has importance and priority for people themselves in their own situation. In other words, not an imposed outside vision of what's important, but a knowledge co-production driven by how people themselves define what's important to them. And so I want to just give you some examples of how this has worked. The first one is in Freetown in Sierra Leone, where communities' capacities were developed with our city partner SLURC, the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center, working with the Federation of the Urban Poor and ASF. And what we see here is the settlements, the informal people in informal settlements organizing to co-produce an informal settlement profile. In other words, what they're doing here is making informality visible in the city, counting it, counting people as a basis for negotiation, for example, for land and housing security, for better living conditions, and doing it in a kind of way that is recognized, I put inverted commas, scientific, okay, in the way of collecting data and presenting data in a way that would be recognizable to policymakers and planners. And it consists here, we can see in the process in Freetown included capacity building, self-enumeration processes, and the production of settlement profiles. And what we have here then is the basis for the formulation of community area action plans, which are action plans developed by communities themselves. And action plans developed by communities themselves about their own areas in order to negotiate with the planning system. The second example is in Tanzania, where our partners, the Community Center Initiatives, worked with the Tanzanian Federation of the Urban Poor and the UCL Institute for Global Prosperity. And I think I brought this example for two reasons. One is working in Vingunguti settlement. What we saw here was the co-production of a localized prosperity index. In other words, to make the views and the priorities of residents in informal settlements visible, not just about their poverty, which is always the emphasis of work, but of how they view prosperity, how they view the good life, okay? And to do this through capacity building in the community to actually undertake their own surveying, their own data processing to create this prosperity index in order ultimately to engage with wider policy discussion about prosperity in the policy agendas that are ongoing in the city and at the national level. So I think this is an interesting, and certainly communities were trained not only to carry out interviews, but also, for example, trained in vivo to process data and to develop the prosperity index that reflected their aspirations and priorities. Now, the second pathway I want to talk to is the strengthening of civil society institutions to bridge civil society government relations. And here I'm talking about institutional structures which go beyond traditional participation. We know that many local governments may not work well, may not work as we'd like, but there are elements of participation currently ongoing in programs and projects in many places. What we're talking here is actually a different set of institutional, adding to that, institutions which can actually make visible and reframe knowledge developed through co-production as a bridge between civil society and governments. And here we've seen emerging a range of different strategies. what we've seen is the creation of what we've called urban learning platforms in cities, or community committees in other places they've been named. And they're strategies to connect with local government officers and politicians that have had to be developed by these platforms, strategies to maintain their autonomy and their legitimacy because they exist between communities and local government. So they have to have some legitimacy on both sides. And what's of course also important, that they have to build in sustainability. And as we know, this is a huge challenge for any kind of civil society structure that's created. How is it maintained and developed over time? And here I'd love to share with you again the work from Freetown, an amazing, I think, example of an independent structure that was created to make informal settlements visible as active citizens in urban governance processes. And what I've got here is a diagram that reflects the creation of what are called community learning platforms in up to 9 communities in Freetown, which then can represent the interests and the priorities of informal settlements through a city learning platform that was formed to bridge the relationship between local government and communities, and then also to be able to link to national frameworks. These structures are active, and so the community learning platforms, for example, have on them youth leaders, women's leaders, organizations of the urban poor, religious leaders, traditional leaders, councillors, zone representatives, and there was an agreement between everyone to ensure gender and age quotas in terms of this representation. And so these are active entities that are bridging relationships. And as it happens in the context of Freetown, there is a dynamic mayor who has her own, leading her own very dynamic agenda called Transform Freetown. And this structure was able to bridge and continues to do so, not without problems, but continues to try to make sure that the views and the priorities of informal settlements in Freetown are actually reflected in and addressed in the Transform Freetown agenda. I want to go on to a slightly different example, which is an example in Nakhon Sawan in Thailand, where communities, very highly organized communities, decided to evaluate the impact of a national housing policy. It was a national housing policy that was led in a partnership between the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights and CODI, the National Housing Authority in Thailand, and that actually delivered housing in a program called Ban Man Kon in partnership with local community organizations. And what the communities decided to do was to evaluate the impact of that program, which had happened some years before, to see what had changed in the lives of people in the city. So it builds on community structures that were there, but now is wanting to extend the capacity of these structures to evaluate policy for themselves. They trained 100 community members and students to evaluate the impact of Ban Man Kon. They conducted structured interviews and site visits, and the research they did and the findings that they developed led into the strengthening of a community development committee, which represents communities in the city, and indeed we hope will begin to trigger a new phase of the Ban Man Kon program in the city with the support of the mayor. And an unforeseen outcome, I think, is a really interesting outcome, was that this process of doing this work with community members and students actually helped community members and students rediscover the history of the collective struggle in the city from the past, that struggle which had brought them the first round of housing from National Housing Program. And so in a sense, what it did was rejuvenate the structures of community organization and created the conditions for the succession of a new generation in the community networks. And indeed, with the oncome of the pandemic, these community networks actually help to support the community through extremely difficult times. And so the survey combined with the pandemic actually has resulted in a substantial expansion of this community network with, I think, important implications for urban governance in the future of Nakhon Sawan. Now, I want to go to the final pathway, governance pathway, which is the actual focusing specifically on wanting to co-create or to change policy planning or design. And here we're talking about priorities that are set and articulated through knowledge co-production by communities in order to making it visible and reframing it, and then translating that knowledge to reformulate policy planning and design. And here, what we've seen is many of these processes in the No program started with the creation of multi-actor groups. And the big question, of course, is with whom and what kind of institutional arrangements one enters into. Then a process of the co-production of knowledge. And then what one can see is the negotiation and the translation of knowledge into policy and planning practices. And the final very important element, which is the negotiation and the strategies to institutionalize those changes. In other words, that those changes won't be swept away in the next couple of years just because the actors or cast of characters change. That obviously this involves negotiating very different interests sometimes. A state that may be interested in increasing revenues and maintaining alliances with the private sector, creating tensions with organized civil society interested in maintaining their rights to secure housing and land. And I think just to put this in a diagram, what we see is that in the different No City teams, a different kind of constellation of actors from different sectors, following a kind of process of forming, let's call it a community of practice, which together plan together what's to be done, build capacity and share ideas, and then move into the research and capacity building based on an ethics of practice, which has been very central to the No program, and based on reflexive learning in that process, and ultimately with the outputs of that to actually translate that knowledge in a way that actually starts to expand and strengthen partnerships and the action space that will ultimately lead to governance pathways to urban equality. So this is a kind of summary in diagrammatic form of processes that I'd like to share here, for example, in Lima, which is the co-designing of community kitchens in Lima, where we see the University PUC working with NGOs and communities and the municipality in Lima. And given the impact of the pandemic on food insecurity in the city, communities, poor communities in the city fell back on a history of actually running community kitchens to mitigate this kind of challenge. And so organized civil society went back to those ways of doing things, but to bring them to kind of try to improve them, they built with the partners a community of practice in order to co-produce knowledge and design for the community kitchens that actually improved the infrastructure and the way that they were working. And this was done very much in partnership with the municipality, has been implemented in some cases and actually built. And the key thing here, I think, which is interesting, is it's also been institutionalized in planning regulation, so that there is the basis for replicating this, not only in Lima, but maybe in other parts of the country. My final example here is of, again, another interesting process of the recognition of cultural heritage in tourism development in Da Nang in Vietnam, where we see Da Nang Architecture University working with local fishing communities, the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights, and later with the municipality and the museum. And what we have here is a response to a very fast industrializing and urbanizing city, actually quite a wealthy city, that is trying to create a world tourist destination city vision. But in that process, many traditional occupations have been sidelined, and in some cases are starting to be lost. And one of those occupations is fishing communities and their culture and their local knowledge, which is increasingly threatened and disappearing. And so what we've seen here is a process that has documented and mapped fishing villages and found how many have been uprooted in that process, how many have lost livelihoods, and also looked at the impact on community cohesion, which is badly affected. And in knowledge sharing, in training, workshops, study visits between fishing community leaders, local governments, and students, one's begin to see a common recognition of the problem here. When they started, fishing communities were invisible to government actors, but now they became more visible, and indeed to the communities themselves out of this process formed a regional fishing community network, and they also then began to look at ways through which fishing communities might survive, trying to talk to the world tourist destination vision that planners and policymakers had, and began to try to learn from experiences of community-based tourism, linking heritage to tourism. And what we see now are pilots having been established in 4 of these fishing villages, and an actual agreement between the network and the Ministry of Tourism and the university. And so what we start to see here is the beginning of something different happening in the lives of this group of people in the context of urban governance. Now, based on these 3 kind of pathways, which, as I said, have overlaps, they merge into each other, but they also move away from each other. And what we see here, I think, is some interesting things. And what I want to do now is just highlight 5 points that I think demonstrate the possibilities and limitations of co-production in strengthening urban governance. The first is that in conceptualizations of urban governance, there's been a tendency to separate the political from the technical administrative dimensions of governance. And I think what this shows is that how super important it is to recognize the political character of technical administrative dimension. Often the bureaucracy of local government likes to present itself as neutral, and clearly it isn't. It reflects configurations of power at a particular moment in history, and in some context, that history is also an inherited history, a colonial history, which still plays out, for example, in the policymaking and planning procedures of many countries. They still have the vestiges of colonial planning in them. And of course, that bias, that political character also comes through in the way these technical administrative structures are peopled, the way they're used and applied by actors with particular ideologies that relate to questions of like the intersection of class and gender, ethnicity, etc., that reproduce inequalities in the way they work. And here, for example, even in the way in which housing criteria for access to housing is set up, access to funds, the way that planning regulations, building regulations demand certain materials excludes people, certain kinds of people in the process of urbanization. So what we've seen in some of the interactions in the development of these pathways is that co-production of knowledge is a way that can actually expose the political biases in apparently neutral technical dimension. And so it leads to very important questioning. The one that I've talked a lot about this afternoon is the questions approaching of how informality is understood in the city. As we know, in many cities, informality is criminalized. And what many of the residents in informal settlements, in the way they've organized, is basically a way to mobilize and challenge against that kind of conceptualization, and to address head-on those kind of biases in the way that they're treated. And one can similarly identify, for example, questions related to gender and related to other social identities. So the political character of the bureaucracies that we're dealing with in urban governance, I think, has to be recognized and has to be addressed head on. And knowledge co-production can help that discussion. The next point is one that I've alluded to already, which is to challenge the view of the urban practitioner as the so-called professional expert, and to recognize other city makers and practitioners in the city. So, for example, the activist practitioner can mobilize agendas for the right to the city through strengthening capacities to support community government engagement in urban governance in at least two of the, and three, I would argue in all three of the governance pathways that I've talked about. I think what this does, it puts in the spotlight the role of universities to look more closely at what they teach and the kind of urban practitioner they produce and the way in which they actually carry out public engagement. And so this is maybe a fertile ground for discussion. I think too, my fourth point here, my third point here, is the treatment of network governance. And I think looking at urban governance these days, yes, we've seen this fragmentation into a much wider range of actors. But I think what's important is to keep an eye on who's in the network and what power they have. And the question of representation is critical, but so is the question of competition between different political entities that have entered this arena. And I think in this context, there is enormous pressure on maintaining partnerships with equivalence. Let's not be naive about this, okay? That when we're dealing, obviously, in situations of unequal power, there is a pressure on partnerships with equivalence, and co-production under certain conditions can strengthen relationships and open action spaces for change. But we also know full well that actors and their agendas can be co-opted, they can be resisted, or worse, okay? Which we've seen in some countries. So I think this is an important dimension, I think, for me, a conclusion to think about. My fourth point is one that we learned through the pandemic, actually, that when you strengthen network governance, you can build resilience into community structures in a way that can respond to multiple disasters. We saw this in the pandemic in many countries, even where governments were supportive, but in many places where governments were not supportive, that communities stepped in to support the poorest of the poor and to do a range of issues, to look after neighbors, to look after neighborhoods. And so what we see here is the potential to mainstream disaster risk reduction in urban governance in the face of everyday risk and multiple disasters, including the impact of climate change, in the way that I think strengthened network governance, therefore, has a multiple role in this respect. My final remark is, of course, that co-production of knowledge is only one strategy to change urban governance. It does not replace politics and the right to protest and to make political claims. Of course, I think that in the way that I've talked about it and the examples I've given, we've seen that it can broaden participation in the process of change. It makes possible the expansion of the room for maneuver to shape governance pathways to urban equality, but without relinquishing politics and the power of protest. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be able to share the work of the No program to this point. Thank you.
No te escuchamos.
Rodrigo, you're on mute.
Yes. Perdón, sorry. Sí, bueno, muchas gracias, Caren, por tu muy interesante presentación. Creo que son varios los aprendizajes que podemos sacar de la experiencia que ustedes han desarrollado con respecto a cómo entender la planificación o cómo entender el desarrollo de la ciudad y también cómo entender la gobernanza, más allá de los límites institucionales, llevándolo a ampliar el espectro de actores, de experiencias, de conocimientos a la hora de construir una mejor ciudad o un mejor territorio. Pero bueno, dicho sea eso, quisiera ahora darle la palabra a la profesora Paola Jirón, que va a dar los comentarios de esta presentación, pero primero quisiera, presentarla. Paola Jirón es profesora asociada de la Facultad de Arquitectura y Urbanismo de la Universidad de Chile, académica del Instituto de la Vivienda, y actual coordinadora del doctorado en Territorio, Espacio y Sociedad de la Universidad de Chile. Es también investigadora asociada de las dimensiones socioeconómicas del conflicto del Centro de Estudios del Conflicto y Cohesión Social, COES. Su principal área de investigación, incluye los estudios urbanos desde las miradas que relacionan la experiencia del habitar, movilidad, vida cotidiana, enfoque de género y metodologías cualitativas de investigación. Paola también es directora del Núcleo Milenio Movilidades y Territorio. Muchas gracias, Paola, por estar acá con nosotros y te damos el espacio para tus comentarios. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Rodrigo, por la invitación. Caren, ¿me escuchas? ¿Sí? Ella está escuchando, ¿cierto? Bueno, y muchas gracias por invitarme a compartir con alguien a quien conozco hace muchísimo tiempo. Es alguien que tiene una trayectoria muy importante y es un lujo tenerla aquí, aunque sea virtualmente. Ella ha venido muchas veces a Chile, conoce muy bien lo que nosotros vivimos en Chile. Hay una cantidad de estudiantes chilenos también que han estudiado con ella y en el DPU en general. Así es que Caren está muy al tanto de lo que vivimos nosotros tanto en Chile como en América Latina, y creo que su trabajo, tanto en los temas de género durante mucho tiempo, pero también sobre todo en el ámbito de la planificación urbana, han sido fundamental para muchas de las personas que trabajan en este ámbito. Así es que es un gusto poder comentar y escuchar lo que están haciendo. Yo más o menos había seguido un poquito el trabajo del proyecto, pero claro, escuchándolo se nota que el impacto en tantas ciudades o el nivel de trabajo en tantas ciudades debe ser muy complejo. Es muy difícil llevar a cabo un proyecto en una ciudad. Me imagino lo complejo que es llevar a cabo un proyecto en tantas ciudades distintas. Y me surgen muchísimas preguntas y comentarios, pero quizás hay algo quizás voy a empezar con las conclusiones con las que Caren trabaja o menciona, que tiene que ver con la dimensión política de lo técnico. O del ámbito técnico, y ahí me resultan hartas preguntas. Nosotros en Chile, Caren, estamos en un proceso muy complejo en estos momentos, donde todo el tema de la ciudad, del territorio y la gobernanza empiezan a ser fundamentales, y pareciera ser que tenemos ciertas debilidades, o tenemos claramente debilidades institucionales para llevar a cabo los desafíos que tenemos. Algo que nosotros hemos identificado y claramente con tu trabajo sobre la institucionalización es que el mundo técnico-administrativo no es homogéneo, no es una persona, es un ámbito muy grande y muy complejo, y desde el nivel de la persona que es electa, el alcalde, por ejemplo, que toma muchas decisiones, y el practitioner, ¿no? La persona que está en terreno o los mandos medios dentro de las instituciones, hay un campo gigante de conocimientos, de posibilidades, de de formas de conocer. Entonces ahí lo que nosotros hemos detectado es que no solamente es importante el trabajo con las comunidades, que es elemental, pero lo que hemos visto en el caso chileno es que los mandos medios que están llevando a cabo la planificación urbana y los que están a diario haciendo el trabajo, se les ve como que se les ignora, ¿no? No son agentes de cambio y no es allí donde se están poniendo muchas de las energías de posibilidades de transformación. Entonces, y ahí traemos a este tema que tú mencionas sobre la planificación colonial, ¿no? En Chile y en América Latina, la discusión sobre la decolonialización de ciertas prácticas, sobre todo del urbanismo, ha sido muy importante y está siendo un eje de discusión. Entonces quería ver en ese sentido, ¿cómo ves tú o cómo podríamos conversar un poco sobre el rol que tiene el urbanismo, por un lado, como disciplina, y esto que tú estás hablando que tiene que ver con formas de gobernanza que casi no hablaste, de la disciplina del urbanismo y de la disciplina de la planificación urbana, sino más bien de diversas formas en que estas se llevan a cabo. Hay algo que nosotros estamos replanteando de una urgencia en el caso chileno sobre replantear las formas en que se piensa el urbanismo, ¿no? Replantear de manera seria las formas en que nosotros enseñamos el urbanismo en nuestras universidades, no solamente como una forma de diseñar la ciudad, sino precisamente con estas formas que tú estás planteando de repensar las maneras y los conocimientos que están a disposición para llevar a cabo la planificación urbana. Y en ese sentido hay una responsabilidad gigante por parte de las universidades, de los centros de formación, porque las personas que están tomando decisiones surgen de nuestras universidades también, pero no es allí donde se está poniendo la discusión sobre la generación o regeneración o coproducción de conocimiento, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué pasa con esos mandos medios? ¿Y qué pasa con la formación y con la forma en que entendemos la planificación urbana, la planificación territorial, que es algo que yo creo que nos falta mucho en discusión? Eso es como una de las discusiones que me gustaría que si pudieras comentar. Otro tema que se me hace muy interesante, Caren, y que no lo menciona porque me imagino que por falta de tiempo, en cada una de estas ciudades o de estos lugares que mencionas, sea en Sierra León, con desarrollar capacidades para que las comunidades, por ejemplo, visualicen o presenten ciertos datos, o en Tanzania con el tema del índice de prosperidad, que se me hace súper interesante verlo de manera positiva y no de pobreza, ¿no? Como, o en otras partes, ¿cuál es la metodología de trabajo que ustedes implementan en este tipo de investigación? ¿Cómo llegan a las comunidades? ¿Cómo se acercan? Porque por lo que mencionas, utilizan distintas estrategias metodológicas para acercarse a las comunidades. Entonces, ¿cómo es eso? ¿Cómo es ese trabajo? Porque creo que una de las herramientas importantes que creo que tiene que ver con el caso de los pescadores en Vietnam es cómo visualizamos elementos o realidades que normalmente no se ven. Cómo hacer visible comunidades, prácticas, personas que son ausentes, que están invisibles, que son invisibles para el planificador o para la comunidad o para el público en general. Nosotros en Chile estamos viviendo un proceso de elecciones y uno de los temas que por muchos años ha estado invisible, por ejemplo, es el narcotráfico, ¿no? Es un problema de seguridad que lo tratan no la planificación urbana, sino que lo trata el ministerio o la policía, ¿no? Siendo que el narcotráfico es uno de los principales problemas en las poblaciones, no solamente en regiones metropolitanas, sino en todo el país. Y es un tema que no se discute como un problema serio, no es visible para la planificación urbana ni para la gobernanza urbana, es un tema de seguridad. Entonces, ¿cómo ves la posibilidad cuando se visibilizan, cuando se hacen visibles ciertas problemáticas que son complejas, algunas son positivas, algunas son muy complejas, cómo se tratan, ¿no? Cómo se empiezan a hacer dialogar estas temáticas, que por ejemplo en el caso de nosotros el tema del narcotráfico en América Latina es fundamental, pero no es un tema que esté abordado por la planificación urbana. De hecho, el Ministerio de la Vivienda, por ejemplo, en Chile no lo ve, no lo toma porque es un tema complejo. Eso, y por último, está esto último que mencionas, que creo que es un eje fundamental. Yo me imagino que tiene mucho que ver con tus preocupaciones con temas de género, que tiene que ver con el tema de los cuidados. Y lo que encuentran en el caso de Lima con las ollas comunes, que es un tema que ha pasado en todas partes en época de pandemia. Nosotros en Chile también tenemos esa situación donde empezamos a ver que la preocupación por la reproducción de la vida debiese ser o podría ser un eje fundamental en los temas territoriales que no son vistos hoy en día como fundamentales. Todavía se sigue viendo que la ciudad tiene que ser productiva, tenemos que seguir construyendo viviendas, pero todo este tema que tiene que ver con la reproducción de la vida y los temas de cuidado todavía se ven como temas de mujeres solamente. Entonces, cuando ese tema además se le ve como algo que llevan a cabo las comunidades, ¿cómo se hace responsable el Estado? En el caso chileno, el Estado no se hizo responsable durante la pandemia de muchos de los problemas de reproducción de la vida, precisamente con comunidades pobres. Es decir, el Estado se replegó y fueron las comunidades y las familias las que tuvieron que asumir gran parte de la responsabilidad del cuidado, sea cuidado de niños, de adultos mayores, de alimentación, de salud, del uso del espacio público. El Estado no nos permitía usar el espacio público. Entonces, ¿qué pasa cuando las comunidades se ven sobrepasadas? Y entiendo lo de los saberes y cómo empoderar a las comunidades, pero ¿qué pasa cuando se le carga la mano a las comunidades y el Estado se repliega por completo, como en el caso chileno, y las comunidades se ven sobrepasadas, ¿no? ¿Qué pasa con eso? ¿Cómo reflexionan ustedes sobre eso, que es algo que está pasando en Chile, pero lo hemos escuchado en todas las ciudades de América Latina, donde las comunidades se están llevando, y sobre todo mujeres en el área comunitaria, se están llevando el peso importante de los cuidados? Esas son tres áreas, Caren, que me interesan, son grandes y son importantes. Tengo preguntas así muy específicas, pero creo que eso lo podemos ir viendo más adelante. Pero eso más o menos como comentarios y preguntas que yo me imagino que se pueden conversar durante todo un programa de Magíster en detalle. Pero más o menos esas preguntas, Rodrigo y Caren, lo dejo por ahí.
Muchas gracias, Paola. Muchas gracias por tus profundas reflexiones y pertinentes preguntas. Ciertamente que, yo creo que Caren, lo mejor es que le demos el espacio ahora para que también haga comentarios respecto a estas importantes inquietudes que surgen en nuestros contextos, en nuestros escenarios particulares, sobre todo el latinoamericano en este caso. No sé si hay preguntas también que la audiencia quiera realizar. Por favor, pueden escribirla a través de las plataformas que estamos utilizando. Y yo, obviamente le doy la palabra a Caren para que pueda responder o contarnos más.
I'll do my best to respond, but obviously all the questions you raised, Paola, are ongoing discussions and debates for all of us in some way or another. And I'd also like to acknowledge that it's wonderful to be on the same platform as you again. So it's a pleasure to respond. I would like to say, first of all, that I think it's really what you point out around the middle management within bureaucracies, I think is a really important comment. And I suppose that I know that in many of the cases within the KNOW program, co-production of knowledge has actually started conversations between communities and that group of people who you rightly say are often overlooked and who don't have a lot of power to change things, but they do have some power because they certainly exercise the power often to block things. And so I think it's important to recognize that there is potential power there that can be engaged with. And of course, people have to want to listen, first of all. And so we are talking about the conditions under which this kind of co-production can take place. And I think this is, if you like, it has to be a very political strategy of identifying allies and friends in the structures and beginning to draw more and more people in over time and to develop a shared conversation. So I know that this isn't always easy, and it's not easy when there's a lot of turmoil and conflict going on generally around, for example, in the middle of an election or even in the middle of conflict. It may be very, very difficult to do something like this. But I do believe that the cases that we've looked at do demonstrate that it is possible to engage this middle level bureaucracy and to begin to make, to begin to develop common conversations and to begin to challenge assumptions about each other. There are amongst the partners within the No program, places where the poor are regarded extremely badly, where in some countries, you know, they're not even regarded as citizens actually. And so I think changing that kind of mentality and demonstrating through doing is a very important dimension of the co-production of knowledge. On the other side of the argument, I think the question of what universities do about it and how they teach the next generation of urban practitioners, for me, is something very, very close to my heart. And I do believe all of us have a responsibility to strongly critique our curriculum and to understand what it is that we need to do. And I think there is a tension here between the profession and the education of the next you know, generation of urban practitioners. But we have to, in education, we have a responsibility to dig deeper, to expose the assumptions, and to understand more deeply how it is that planning and policy making can reproduce inequalities in cities, and in sometimes in very dramatic ways. And I don't think policymakers and planners should run away from realities that when they take a decision, sometimes it means that people lose their houses, they lose their land, they lose their foothold in a city. And this is something we should take very, very seriously. For me, it's part of the ethics of our profession. And I think that as people working in education, this is something we need to examine a lot more closely. And this has been an important part of the No program. So do have a look on our website at the work of a work stream that is looking specifically at education and at the broader processes of learning in the city. I think there is a lot of important work to share there. In the second comment that you made, you know, Paola, you will also know that the DPU has worked with partners in different parts of the world for a long, long time. And the No program was able to work with many of those partners. And those partners are themselves have been working with communities for a long time. And I think that means that the program can connect to communities in the city. Doesn't mean that they connect to all communities. So the question of who's represented is still an important one. But I think that when you start to work with communities and you can start to work in a co-produced way, you can begin to start to make visible the invisible in a much more structured way and in a much more honest way, in a sincere way. It can be a very difficult process, and there may always be marginalized groups that are left out of this process. But you're more likely, I think, to reach and to make visible groups when you work collectively with communities who themselves know exactly who's marginalized in their communities. They know, everybody knows on the ground who's marginalized. But nobody bothers to ask. You know, policymakers and planners just don't ask people what they think and who, you know, what's going on at the community level. And I think the co-production of knowledge can make a step change in this respect. So I'm not saying that this is an easy process, but I think it is a more hopeful process of being able to reach that goal. On the question of community kitchens, I thank you for asking that question. And I think that I think what has been shocking about the pandemic has been not just its impact on life and its tragic consequences for many families, but also the fact that the restrictions that were put in place by many governments were practices that simply wouldn't work for the majority of people in many countries. People can't isolate if they're living in a low-income settlement where densities are very high. They can't work at home if they don't have a home. They can't work, you know, they can't be expected to change the structure of their livelihoods when they're doing casual work and day-to-day processes of survival. So we're talking about restrictions that were simply not possible for most people. And not only that, but we were often talking about governments in many cases that took top-down action that didn't recognize the amazing soft infrastructure that existed in the communities of many cities. And I think that communities, you know, in this context, yes, women are at the forefront of care around something like the community kitchens. And I think the ultimately what we're talking about is how we value that process. And I think it's up to communities themselves, not only governments, to recognize the value of that work and to recognize the value of the contribution that it's made. And when I say value, I don't mean financially necessarily, although that's also an important dimension, but I mean also the value into the social value. And I think that you know, the care dimension for many women is often a taken for granted dimension of the gender division of labor in most places. And so here we're talking about actually in some way recognizing that value and celebrating it and also recognizing that how will it translate in a post-pandemic future? I think this is the challenge. If we're really going to change the gender division of labor, how is this going to translate in a post-pandemic future? And so I think there are lots of interesting and important questions here, which I think there's a lot to learn from the history of community kitchens in Peru, for example, around this question. But I think, yes, there's a lot I think we still have a lot to digest from this experience and to think about in terms of the impact. And in many cases, I think communities are still quite traumatized and quite you know, impacted by the pandemic. We're not through it yet. And these will be ongoing discussions. It would be nice if we could take also additional questions and discussions from the wider audience, if there are any.
Justamente iba a preguntar eso. Diego, ¿sabes si hay preguntas de la audiencia?
Hola, Rodrigo. La pregunta que me compartiste, ¿la leo desde acá?
Sí, ¿te parece? Gracias.
Perfecto. Caren está escuchando en inglés, ¿cierto? ¿O se la traduzco?
Está en inglés, sí.
Súper. ¿Cuáles son los desafíos que han tenido que abordar para pasar de un escenario con diferentes agentes e intereses y agendas hacia un espacio de colaboración?
Do you mean in the No program, or broadly in urban governance?
I think that is oriented to the No program.
Yes. Well, as I said right at the beginning, we have attempted to operationalize partnerships with equivalents in the program, which means that decision-making is decentralized. Our local partners in each of the cities decided their own priorities of what they wanted to research and how they wanted to engage with urban equality. Of course, we share a lot of common discussions, and that's what pushes the agendas forward, is that kind of exchange. That's where the learning comes in enormously powerfully, which we do on a regular basis. So we create regular moments for sharing of different kinds, from workshops on specific topics to a monthly contact call to an annual workshop where we can go into much more detail. So there are different ways in which we've created this capacity to share and learn. And we also have different vehicles for that. So we have a newsletter, which I think my colleague David Heyman has already put online. You can have a look online. We've created blogs, and we also, in the context of COVID, realized very quickly that the communities we were working with were experiencing very dramatic changes, and we created a COVID Stories webpage where you can also find a lot of that experience recorded. So I think that really it's about creating the right structures which facilitate communication, facilitate sharing, and facilitate the sharing not just of knowledge, but also of skills across the network within the No program. I don't know if that helps explain well.
I think it does. Thanks a lot, Caren.
No sé si alguien más tiene alguna pregunta que quisiera hacer, o a lo mejor Paola, si... acá hay una mano levantada.
Ahora también levantó la mano Rodrigo.
Perfecto.
Sí. Hola, buenas tardes. ¿Sí me ven? ¿Me escuchan?
Hola, Héctor.
Hello.
Yes.
Hablo en español porque creo que va a ser más fácil para mí. Y me llamó mucho la atención, me llamó mucho la atención el último elemento que habla sobre este componente de educación. Y quisiera saber si ustedes dentro del proyecto problematizaron o preguntaron sobre la cuestión no solamente de educar a estas nuevas generaciones, pero también cómo potenciar la capacitación de los profesores o de las comunidades científicas locales. Esto en el trasfondo, por ejemplo, en mi experiencia, ahorita soy de México, estoy trabajando fuera de la Ciudad de México en una universidad que yo llamaría de periférica con respecto a la discusión en internacional, en inglés. Y aquí la pregunta es, no sé si ustedes en la experiencia de las diferentes ciudades en las que trabajaron, tuvieron esa experiencia. Y mi pregunta sería, ¿qué tipo de estrategias puedes ver o visualizas o implementaron con respecto a estas comunidades que principalmente son los que estarían formando? Entonces, creo que mi pregunta va a un paso hacia atrás, no solamente la educación de los de lo que podemos hacer como investigadores y dando cursos en posgrado, pero también en la formación de estos colegas, o cómo capacitamos estas redes de comunidades científicas en esos lugares para que también contribuyan a estos procesos de coproducción y de co-learning.
Hector, this has been a very important question for us. And I think I could encapsulate, of course, there's the traditional way, which, you give good papers at conferences and you go through the traditional networks. But what's also happened is that through the experience of the program, colleagues in different cities have built on the experience of co-production and developed modules around the co-production of knowledge, which they built with colleagues in their universities, not necessarily associated with KNOW, and have now been able to introduce them into courses. And of course, the topic of the co-production of knowledge opens up a lot of questions about the usual way of doing business. So it's a first step to open up that kind of discussion. And I think what we found is that students, young people, are enormously interested in this topic. And I think they will vote with their feet in terms of, coming to those courses and to taking those modules. And I think it's one way of beginning to get different ways of doing things into the curriculum. The other strategy has been, for example, our colleagues in Cuba are developing a network of educators. So in other words, educators of like mind who are working in different in different universities, who are interested in working with the co-production of knowledge, who are interested in working on urban equality, and to begin to develop what I called earlier, this urban learning hub. In other words, to have one strand of that urban learning hub, a network of educators in the country who think similarly. Now, you can, as you know, you can begin to do lots of things with that network over time. That network can be a loose, informal network. It can come together for conferences, for workshops. It can represent that group of people at conferences and at different big events. And so there's different ways in which a network like that can be expanded over time. And I think there's a lot of interest in how that's going to develop. Then, of course, there is directly tackling curriculum development. And this is what our colleagues and our partners in India have done. The Indian Institute for Human Settlements have, in a sense, dissected and totally deconstructed the planning curriculum and have reconstructed a very different kind of curriculum for the next generation of urban planners, based on a very different set of principles. And so of course, it's a much longer term process. It takes time to build that up. But again, now we have experience, and we also have a network of people who have done that in some way or another internationally, and who can, be part of the conversation to the extent that local educators would like to engage internationally. So I think there are different ways to move forward on this.
Muchas gracias, Karen. No sé si hay alguna otra pregunta, bueno, también en función del tiempo, o a lo mejor Paola quisiera agregar algo más a la conversación.
No, yo creo que, Karen trabaja en la planificación transformativa, y yo creo que sería muy importante ver cómo ciertas cosas de esa forma de pensar la planificación se traducen en las formas en que se lleva a cabo esta coproducción de conocimiento, si es parte de, o si es una continuidad, o si esta forma de pensar la planificación genera o se retroalimenta de la coproducción de conocimiento. ¿Cómo trabaja ella el tema de la planificación transformativa en general en relación a este proyecto?
Sorry, I'm not sure I got the question. Sorry, Paola.
I just wanted to see, how do you relate the way transformative planning is related to the co-production of knowledge? Is it an intrinsical part of the way you think about transformative planning, or is it something that just feeds into it? How do you relate both ways of thinking?
I think it's part of the process of transformative planning, very much a central part of it. And I think the transformation comes in the collective character of it. And because I think through the collective character of it, you have more chance of actually challenging the ways of the paradigms that people bring to the table. When you do things collectively, it creates that possibility to actually start to talk, not just about the immediate issues, but the deeper assumptions and the biases within the paradigms that people hold about the city, about informality, about the role of different actors, about social identities, about the whole range of issues. And I think that it offers an opportunity, as I said, for social learning in that process. And I think obviously social learning is a fundamental part of transformation. And of course, social learning isn't always a nice, smooth process either. It can be pretty conflictive. But I think that that doesn't mean that we should shy away from it. We should learn how to manage that. And I think it's really through that process of social learning that we begin to raise the important questions, the questions, the deep questions that will change the paradigms. We need a paradigm shift. We absolutely need a paradigm shift in the way that we think about the city, the way we understand policymaking and planning. And without it, we're not going to be able to deal with the challenges we face. And so that paradigm shift comes with a questioning of basic assumptions, with a consciousness raising, with a conscientization process, where people recognize the importance, sometimes the importance of turning the world upside down, which isn't an easy thing to do, but turning their own worlds upside down in terms of the thinking and how things are looked at. And I think that this is a really important, an important process. And there are many, many examples that I could give where, in a way, the penny drops, and people recognize, oh, okay. For example, on the question of urban risk, we talk a lot about urban risk. It's always seen in terms of the risk to poor people. But actually, for many poor communities, what we understand through the work done with them is that they regard engagement with government and formal actors often as a huge risk to them, right? They take a risk when they enter that engagement because governments don't understand their situations. They often impose completely unrealistic conditions on the engagement. And so it's something that has to be thought about extremely carefully before communities might choose to engage with formal traditional structures. And so I think it's about turning things around and becoming more conscious of how different actors in the city perceive problems like risk. For example.
Yeah, perhaps in that sense, Caren, in Chile, one of the discussions has to do with privilege, how people that are extremely privileged think about inequality, because it implies changing their own privileges.
Yes, of course. Very difficult to let go the things what the one has.
Así es. Bueno, ya en virtud del tiempo, creo que, bueno, toca el cierre de esta sesión. Primero, por supuesto, quiero agradecer a Caren por su brillante exposición, muy estimulante, sumamente interesante, y por supuesto a Paola por sus precisos comentarios y reflexiones con respecto a esta temática asociada a la coproducción del conocimiento, a cómo entender el desarrollo de las ciudades y el territorio desde otra perspectiva, dar un giro a las formas convencionales de entender el desarrollo de las ciudades, y también, por supuesto, la gobernanza, el momento de las tomas de decisiones. Quiero agradecer también, obviamente, a la audiencia por su participación, por las preguntas sumamente interesantes, y bueno, nos estaremos viendo en una próxima oportunidad. Muchas gracias por todo. Caren, no sé si quieres dar unas últimas palabras de cierre, si tú quieres.
I'd just like to thank you all. It's been wonderful to see some familiar faces again. And I wish you all well. And thank you, Rodrigo, for the invitation.
Muchas gracias a todos. Solamente el último mensajito. El 2 de diciembre es la próxima sesión, la tercera sesión de este ciclo. Para que lo anoten, ya vamos a estar hablando sobre temas de autogestión, cooperativismo y ciudad. Así que están cordialmente invitados, invitadas. Y bueno, nos vemos a la próxima. Nuevamente, muchas gracias, Paola, Caren y a todos y todas. Que estén muy bien. Chao.
Thank you.
Chao, gracias.